This week on To the Contrary.
First, politics and policies on the front lines of the battle against sexual harassment. Then, thousands of girls are now Cub Scouts. Behind the headlines, what makes a successful social movement?
Hello, I'm Bonnie Urbay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, politics and policies on the front lines of the battle against sexual harassment.
73% of millennial women and 53% of men surveyed say they'd never vote for someone accused of sexual harassment. 65% of millennial women wouldn't vote for someone who didn't make addressing sexual harassment a priority. That's according to a new survey out this week that says politicians should be paying attention to the MeToo movement. The survey data come as a coalition of feminist organizations and members of Congress came together to say enough is enough and push for stronger laws and regulations to protect women and men from harassment.
We have had enough with harassment on the job. We have had enough with asking women that have been assaulted what they were wearing. We have had enough with so many anti-woman, anti-discrimination actions that are taking place. And I would say for the first time, this country is taking this issue seriously.
High on the agenda, addressing the issues facing low-wage workers.
Housekeepers and food service workers in our industry have taken charge, have been working on this for many years because they face the harassment from their guests, they face the harassment from management, they face retaliation, which are all very common to all of our industries.
Representative Jackie Speier says workers who depend on tips have their own unique challenges.
Why do we even consider that to be appropriate? $2.13 an hour, and you're on your own to make the rest of your salary. You can see the tensions that arise and how you become victimized almost immediately because you're so reliant on those tips if you're being sexually harassed because you don't want it to reduce your income. You want to be able to put food on the table.
Speier, who has her own Me Too story, says Congress needs to lead the way in addressing harassment and assault. She believes the Congressional Accountability Reform Act, which passed the House and is awaiting Senate approval, can serve as a model.
My bill is the Me Too Congress Act, which is going to clean up Congress. It has been shameful that we've allowed for members to sexually harass their employees and do so with impunity and immunity because the settlements were never made public and the taxpayers picked up the tab. We're changing all of that, and we're empowering the victims for the first time. They will be represented by legal counsel that is provided by the House of Representatives. And the members are going to be held accountable. They'll be identified, and they will have to repay the Treasury for any settlement. I'm very confident we're going to get it out of the Senate and to the President. In all likelihood, it'll be in what's called a must-pass bill, which will force the President with shaky hands to actually sign it.
So, Erin Matson, do you think that the sexual harassment movement will sustain itself, or the anti-sexual harassment movement will sustain itself through the November elections?
No doubt about it, Bonnie. Rage about sexual harassment is going to be one of the factors in the pink wave that's coming.
I disagree. I think that women, when you look at the polling, that is not the top issue for women. It's still the economy, national security, number 2.
It doesn't have to be a top issue, but it's definitely one of the key concerns, and I completely agree with Erin. I think we're at a cultural shift, and women are going to take this to the polls.
And I think it's a unique issue, and then it's one that conservatives and liberals can all come together on.
I read an article a couple weeks back about what the kids out of Florida, the gun control parkland people are doing, and that it's constant, they're bombarding social media with messages about how important this continues to be, and they're doing meetings and marches. and you're very involved in, for example, sustaining the right to choose. Do you think those kinds of tactics will be what it takes to get people, the women who showed up and their families for the Women's March last January, to get them to go to the polls in November?
Yeah, it's not a direct line, Bonnie. You can't take anything for granted, but candidates have incredible ground games. I'm actually getting on a plane tomorrow to go knock doors in Bloomington, Indiana for Liz Watson, who's running for Congress, right? Another perfect example of women who've been inspired to run for office based on what's been going on. And so I think in terms of a social movement, you have to really sustain it and move it forward. Marches matter, right? Getting conversations going in the media matters, but it really comes down to ground game, and so we can't take it for granted.
Do you see these anti-sexual harassment laws becoming law in state or in state legislatures or in Congress?
I think some state legislatures will probably try to push some of these laws, and I think it's important for us to deal with this from a legislative perspective. Now, what remedy is correct? That's another discussion. But from a federal level, I am not sure if we're going to see enough change. I love that in Congress they're actually trying to deal with their own harassment, and some of the allegations that they've had, and ensuring that there is some sort of sunlight brought to the process. But from a national perspective, I don't think there's going to be anything broader than that.
Do you think new laws will change behavior? I mean, there are already laws on the books saying, you can't sexually harass somebody at work, you can't assault them. But if there are new laws, stronger laws, will it work?
I think so. It has to work in tandem. We've never seen a moment like this where women are getting together and just saying no more and calling it out and also sharing their stories. And I think it's interesting because this Me Too movement got a lot of attention because, let's be honest, it was a lot of rich white women sharing their stories, but it has a whole other dynamic to it, which is women of color, poor women who aren't making $20 million per picture, that when they speak up, people are going to listen. But I think it has to happen in tandem.
Your thoughts, Karin?
Yeah, I agree that I think Congress needs to clean up its house first, so I'd like to see some legislative reform there. But beyond that, I really think it's a cultural issue. You can't just legislate it away. So I think we've really got to see a shift in the culture on this topic.
Well, hasn't there been one already? Haven't we seen a cultural shift?
There has been the blinders are off, right? We're now in the moment where people are nervous, right? People harassers and perpetrators are nervous that they're going to be exposed at any moment. So I do think we're seeing a cultural shift in the
But we have seen a lull in the outing. I mean, it was nonstop the end of last year and the earlier part of this year, and it's kind of a lull right now.
Absolutely, but I think the core cultural shift, we are never going to have a meaningful cultural shift so long as the President of the United States is a serial sexual harasser, the allegations of abuse, the open disdain toward women, even the latest now revealing that he didn't even buy his wife a birthday present. I mean, with this sort of disregard and disdain for women coming from the highest office in, frankly, the world, until that changes, I think we can't claim cultural victory.
Well, I think not buying your wife a birthday present maybe is not wise in the marriage, but that doesn't level to the
But she's talking
sexual
about
harassment.
She's talking about the more serious. I mean, obviously, from where I sit, you look at that relationship. There's no relationship.
Well, but I think
it's about money for her and power, staying in power for him.
Well, but I think Erin, with that point, brings up a good point that we do need to make sure to distinguish between true sexual harassment and sometimes like the awkward relationships between men and women. And I think that we've seen, as this movement has continued, that sometimes it's not just about assault or harassment, but has gone into the field of just, awkward relationships, like the comedian. So I think we've got to distinguish that and really stick to focusing on true harassment and assault and rooting those out and ferreting those out and addressing those seriously.
It's all about,
but there have been recent polls have shown that support for those issues is ebbing a little bit, and this whole blue wave that's talked about in November, I've never understood why, but Republicans go to the polls much more faithfully than Democrats. Democrats have to really work at it to get their people to the polls.
And I think
part of sustaining the the pro-gun control and the anti-sexual harassment kind of legislation and attitude is part of that. But then again, you have the Bernie Sanders wing of the party who aren't going to support any Democrat except Bernie or his clones. So how do Democrats hold all that together?
It's going to be a challenge, but I think we're working on it. We got a really loud message with the last elections, which is get to the polls. We can't just be talking and, have our message out in pop culture. We've got to go to the polls. And I think that with the record number of women who are running, more Democratic women than Republican women, we've got that memo and we're working on it. I don't think it's something we're not taking seriously. But to get back on the birthday card point, that comes down to a general respect of women and respect of your wife. And I feel like the same week that your porn star cover-up affair story is exploding, maybe get her a card.
Well, I'll just say, going back to the politics and the elections, again, I think why Democrats are not motivated and may not be motivated enough is because there's not an economic agenda being pushed by progressives right now that's different than or better than what conservatives have come forward with. Tax reform, tax cuts. I mean, people are feeling the everyday impact on their day-to-day lives. And so I think that's going to be a hard case to make, especially when you look at generic polling, which I looked at just this week, where, again, among women, independents, Democrats, and Republicans, the top issue was not women's issues. It was the economy, health care, it was national security, and it was even aging issues for, parents and grandparents. Until progressives have an agenda to push forward, they're not going to make headway.
I just don't understand this. I live in Virginia. Ralph Northam is our governor. We just picked up 15 seats in the House of Delegates, which no one thought was competitive. Doug Jones is the senator from Alabama. He's a Democrat.
But what about Arizona?
Yeah, there's Arizona. Actually, the Republican didn't win by a very large margin. And so there's nothing to take for granted here. Again, I don't want to say that Democrats should sit on their laurels. They have to have an aggressive ground game. But the facts are in front of us. There's a lot of voter enthusiasm out there.
All right. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To The Contrary. From harassment to family scouting.
The Boy Scouts of America have welcomed some 3,000 girls to their Cub Scouting program since announcing the Scouts would start admitting girls. Some 2/3 of the councils nationwide became early adopters as the Boy Scouts continued to develop the program. Each community chooses to make their dens or packs single gender, either all boys or all girls, or a mix of both. Next year, older girls will have the opportunity to become Boy Scouts and work towards the coveted rank of Eagle Scout. Scout officials say they're responding to the needs of busy families, but the Girl Scouts are critical of the move and say it will double down on making its mission to empower girls.
How do you think a teenager would feel about being called an Eagle Scout and a Boy Scout? A female teenager, obviously.
Well, they've now got the choice. And the Boy Scouts are a private organization. They can do what they want here. But I think this is really an indictment of the Girl Scouts that young girls don't want to be Girl Scouts anymore. And I think they've in some ways gotten...
Well, that's not I was actually at a Girl Scout dinner not too long ago, the National Capital Region, which is their largest chapter. And it's really more about efficiency for the parents. The parents don't want to have to drive a daughter to one den and the son to another place, and it's really about being able to drop both kids at the same place. So anyway, go in.
If it was really about that, they could have come up with a way where Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts could maybe meet at the same place or do something. I think it's really a programming difference, and that the Girl Scouts aren't really meeting the need of what young girls want today.
Oh boy, I just don't know that to be the case at all. As a mother of a daughter who's really excited to sell cookies someday and who sees the older girls in the neighborhood and how enthusiastic they are about Girl Scouts, I think it resonates. The Girl Scouts have a fantastic program, and I don't really see this as an either or. There's always going to be an important role for the Girl Scouts, and as a feminist, I so appreciate the hard work that they do to build self-esteem in girls. That said, I'm married to an Eagle Scout, and I want my daughter to have the opportunity to be an Eagle Scout if she chooses to be as well. So I think this is great, and it's not one versus the other.
Yeah, I think the programs need a little bit of a makeover. They need like a little reset, relaunch button and just integrate their programs a little bit more, because as a mother to 2 daughters, let me tell you, and my daughter is in Girl Scouts brownies, but it's so cute. You know what she said the other day? She saw some big girls selling cookies, Girl Scout cookies in our neighborhood, and she said, "Hey, Mom, if we're ever out of money, we can just sell cookies." And I was like, I'm really glad you're worried, but I thought it was great that she was already thinking about earning money.
Yeah, but let me tell you something about selling cookies. My friend who's on the board of the Maryland National Capital Region of the Girl Scouts pointed out to me a couple of years ago, only the Girl Scouts have to sell cookies. The Boy Scouts don't have to. I'm not sure where their money comes from, but clearly a large chunk of the budget for the Girl Scouts comes from selling cookies, and that in and of itself is sexist.
Yeah, it is.
It's quite sexist.
What are the Boy Scouts selling?
Just paying, I don't know, getting grants from foundations.
Just making money.
Corporations, possibly.
Although learning to sell cookies, that's a skill. No matter what you're selling.
Entrepreneurship is important.
Yeah, learning, that's fundraising, that's sales, that's a skill. Don't underestimate that value.
Now, I will say, though, about this, I hope the Boy Scouts get in order their sexual harassment issues. I mean, LA Times did a deep dive into all of the allegations that have occurred at the Boy Scouts. And if you're starting to bring in young girls into this program, I hope that they are not just protecting their boys, but also ensuring that girls will be protected as well. And I actually think that this is more of a takeover by the Boy Scouts into the Girl Scouts area. They recognize not only will they have boys and girls co-ed programs, they're going to have to develop girls-only programs, which is exactly what the Girl Scouts does. So I actually think this is kind of like a hostile takeover.
Well, the thing about Girl Scouts too is that they are very, very much into building girls' self-esteem right at the moment that it's plummeting. We all know, we've all seen the surveys, little girls think they can change the world and rule the world, but when they get into prepubescent eras, that's when they start to lose confidence and think, and it's all into looks and how pretty you are and who's the cheerleader and God knows what else. But Girl Scouts also have really looked to communities of color and to bring those girls into the programs. They've done a fantastic job. How will you be able to have these building self-esteem programs in a co-ed group?
That's a great question. Wait, if I come up with the answer to that, can I pitch my idea to the Scouts? No, that's something they have to really look into, because I feel like when you integrate these programs, it could become competitive in a way that necessarily won't foster, positive confidence.
All right, behind the headlines, winning movements. How do advocates lead successful social and political change?
Grassroots element of any movement is the single most important factor that determines whether you're going to be successful or not. We studied an array of movements, both successful, like the gun rights movement today, the LGBT community's movement for marriage equality, the tobacco control movement. They all had robust, vigorous grassroots mobilization and organization.
Leslie Crutchfield is the executive director of the Global Social Enterprise Initiative. In her new book, How Change Happens, she draws distinct differences between the gun rights and the gun control movements.
So the gun rights movement and the gun control movement couldn't be more different on many dimensions. First of all, the focus on the grassroots. So today, the NRA claims that it has nearly 5 million members. Now, compare that to the gun control movement, which historically, for the last few decades, has had a much lower level of support.
Crutchfield sees things changing for the gun control movement.
Things have really started to shift for the gun control side since Sandy Hook. Shannon Watts, the founder of Moms Demand Action, put together a Facebook page, and now, merging with Mayors Against Illegal Guns, Mayor Bloomberg's book, they created Every Town for Gun Safety. So since 2014, when Every Town for Gun Safety began, they now have 4 million supporters. So there never has been a time in recent history when you've had as many supporters in a gun control organization.
Crutchfield breaks down organizing into 3 categories: leader-full, leader-less, and leader-led movements.
If they're leaderless, they have they're chaotic, they're anarchistic, they they don't really have a unified common direction or purpose. On the other hand, leader-led movements are too top-down. They have more of a command and control hierarchy, and they're organized more like you think in the corporate world or the military. And successful movements find the sweet spot between those two extremes, and they're leaderful. So what do we mean by leaderful? Well, a leaderful movement pushes power and authority out to the local level. They're taking advocacy into their own hands, and they determine the direction and the future of the movement. An example of a leaderful movement today would be the gun rights movement.
Movements can focus directly on changing policies by way of lawmakers, but Crutchfield says businesses are also making social change.
What you've seen in the last few decades is that there's been this sea change where business has been very much involved in many of the major causes that have tipped one way or the other. For instance, the tobacco control movement, a successful push that's cut smoking rates in this country, the U.S., to 15% for adults and under 6% for teens nationally, for young people.
Crutchfield hopes the student-led gun control movement will be successful.
Never doubt that young people can change the world. When you look at some of the most successful movements over many decades, you see students at the helm. I mean, it was students that led the anti-Vietnam War. Students were at the helm of the civil rights movement, and I believe that the #NeverAgain advocates that are coming out of Parkland really have a chance to turn this moment into a movement that can have big impact.
Students were certainly a big factor in Vietnam War, and I was right there with them protesting the war, and that's what changed Nixon's mind. So how are we going to see what the movements are now turn into legislation? Have we seen it, for example, on the gun control front?
I think we're going to be seeing it. Can I tell you, I haven't had any movement give me so much hope and belief than I have with these kids from the Parkland shooting. And can I tell you, that generation grew up with mass shootings. That's not something I grew up with or you grew up with. So I feel like, I read this somewhere and I really agree, like the adults have failed us. I feel like the kids are going to show us the way.
You are an advocate, and you're out there doing grassroots stuff, like you talked about going out to work for the woman running for Congress in Indiana. How do you develop a ground roots strategy, and how do you pursue it?
That's a great question, Bonnie. So what we do at my organization, Repro Action, we focus a lot of our attention and time and energy on activist training. So we do open webinars that are free and open to the public once a month. We do trainings at the community level around the country where we'll do hands-on direct action trainings, hands-on.
But how do you get people to show up for those things?
Actually, we have so much interest in them. Usually the rooms are packed when we do a physical in-person.
How do you contact these people? Is it via the web?
Yeah, we do it both through the web, and then we also have dedicated organizers that organize at the community level who are constantly doing strategy sessions, community forums, organizing actions, one-on-one meetings with individuals who might be connected to other individuals, going and talking to other groups, going and participating in solidarity actions. And so one phrase that I've heard over and over in my organizing career that I think holds so true is to have a friend, be a friend. And so we need to be there for each other.
I mean, it's fascinating, but organizing is not a bad word. I think conservatives are starting to embrace the idea that really it's just talking to people about the issues you care about and helping them to understand why they care too, and then giving them opportunities to do something about it. Now, when it comes to gun rights and gun control, I don't think that we're going to see a lot of federal legislation move through both houses of Congress because it's just not feasible. And when we look at the state level, we're seeing actual legislation that supports gun possession or loosening of restrictions. And I think that goes to the core idea that there are a lot of Americans who may not be on CNN or other networks talking about their support for the Second Amendment, but they exist. They are there, and they want to know that their rights are protected.
And the NRA just had its best fundraising month in 15 years.
Yes.
So does the NRA sort of just have a natural grassroots coalition of people who will come to it, as opposed to Democrats having to go to the grassroots and pull their supporters out to events like you're talking about, to the polls?
Well, I mean, I think they're the only national organization that so embraces the Second Amendment that people know immediately who to go to when they want to take classes or when they want to know that their rights are going to be protected. Are they the only group? No. And there are lots. What's interesting is black women are some of the fastest growing gun owners in this country, and they're starting to have their own self-defense courses and things like that. So I think it's an outgrowth of just this core idea that I should be able to defend myself and retain that right. And movements that are saying, oh, we're just going to take one type of guns, but really it's going to be all types of guns is something that I see coming down the line.
All right, that's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.